You can't do that because by definition you've lost money on your assets, so you're forced to sell your assets to repay the bank. As you sell the assets, you push the prices down, makes the banks demand even more money. You try to sell more assets until eventually you hold your hands up and say, sorry, I can't pay you back. And then the banks hold their hands up and say, sorry, we're bust, and then go to the government and ask for some money. So the point I'm making is that the structure of the market, the structure of the financial markets is very different to the structure of the goods markets. Now, before I come on to what we do about this and why this bubble is so big, I just want to address the core answer to that analysis. And that is the efficient market theorists do have a counter-argument for why these cycles don't dominate. And their argument is, okay, maybe we'll admit that these self-reinforcing cycles happen. But fortunately, there are a whole slew of very smart investors out there who will sell assets when they become too expensive and will buy assets when they become too cheap. So even if we acknowledge that these self-reinforcing cycles drive booms and busts in asset prices, these rational investors will come in and prevent those booms and busts from forming. The problem with that is it assumes that the investors are able to know the value of the assets, the true value of the assets. So the implicit assumption in that is that the investors are looking at various indicators of those values and are able to form a true fair value assessment and will then trade on that. The problem is those variables are all themselves distorted by the process of credit creation. And in the book I split those variables up into broadly three classes. I say there's balance sheet variables, income variables, and broader macroeconomic variables. The balance sheet variables are very clearly distorted by asset price booms. We saw in the dot-com bubble in the 90s, where there was a corporate borrowing binge, we saw a situation where the credit rating agencies were very happy for the corporates to borrow because they were looking at the corporate's balance sheet and looking at the value of the equity and saying, it's fine to borrow more money because your equity is going up. So by definition, a balance sheet variable will never spot a bubble. You'll never spot a bubble in the housing market if the money being borrowed against the houses is being used to buy the houses, because by definition, the asset you're buying is worth the amount of money you're borrowing to buy it. So we can rule out balance sheet variables as being useful indicators. In fact, in the extreme part of the cycle, often the asset prices start to inflate faster than people can borrow. So you get an improvement in the balance sheet variables towards the peak of the cycle. This happened with the household balance sheet in the US. And you get actually a rush to borrow more at the very worst point in the cycle. So I would say balance sheet variables don't just fail to inform, they actively mislead. And the credit rating agencies sort of are part of that process. Then there's the income variables. This is a more subtle one, but it's a very powerful one. If you think about a very simple economy, which is basically one company, everybody works for that company, they buy everything from that company and they take their wages from that company. Now, that's a very closed system. The wages are paid out by the company and then the workers pay the wages back into the company to buy the goods. And it's a nice cycle. Now what happens if we bring borrowing into the system? If the workers start to borrow money to spend the money, they're going to spend more than their wages. So the revenue of the company will go up relative to its cost base. So you will see corporate profits increased as the credit expansion goes on. So if you can persuade some element of the economy to borrow, or more accurately, if you can persuade some element of the economy, the government, the corporate sector, or the private or the household sector, to spend more than their income, then that will pretty quickly drops straight through to corporate profits. And it could emerge in trade deficits and things like that, but generally it will boost corporate profits quite powerfully. So you get this secondary distortion of the variables, whereby as you borrow more, the profitability of the economy rises, the investment in the economy rises, employment rises, macro variables strengthen, and you get a situation where it appears to be rational to keep borrowing more and more. It's safe because the profitability there is there to support the debt. Unfortunately, as we now see, when we go into a credit contraction phase and people start to save more than they're earning, then the company's cost base remains high, their revenue base collapses, and their profitability shrinks. And suddenly the debt looks less sensible. So neither the balance sheet, nor the income statement, nor the macro variables allow investors to build these fair value models in an accurate way. All of those variables are distorted by the credit creation process themselves in such a way that they tend to encourage these boom busts to form. So for that reason, I think we need to reject the Friedman efficient market hypothesis when it comes to asset prices and financial markets. So we're then left with, sorry, I'm just checking the time there. We're then left with, what do we do about that? If the markets are inherently unstable, we can broadly go down two routes. Now, there is a school of thought that says, okay, we have an unstable system because of the credit creation process, we should prevent credit creation. That's essentially what's called an Austrian school. We have another school of thought that says, no, we've got an unstable system, but we need to manage that instability. We've gone down that route. That's why the central banks were formed. If you go back through history, there's a good example in the UK with the formation of the Bank of England, but probably the easiest one to read about is a book called 1907, which is about the formation of the Federal Reserve in the US as a result of a crisis that occurred in America. The central banks were developed precisely because you do get these banking crises, these boom-bust cycles, and they were developed as a lender of last resort to support the financial system when you go into one of these crashes. So that's the core rationale for them. They were born because the markets are unstable. As I say, unfortunately today, the economics profession has convinced themselves that the financial markets are stable, and then they've gradually staffed the central banks with people that believe in that theory. So we have institutions that evolved and were developed precisely because markets are unstable, that are now managed according to principles that say that they're unnecessary. And that gives us, I think, and here I'm not talking about policy here, I'm talking more about policy in the US, but that gives us an unfortunate situation. So if we can accept that the markets are fundamentally unstable, and we do have this credit creation process, so we do need a management process, what should we do about that? Well, in the book I go back to a paper written by a very famous physicist called James Clerk Maxwell. Now, Maxwell was working around about the time of the Industrial Revolution. And apart from developing electromagnetic theory, inventing color photography, developing statistical physics, and proving that our eyes work according to the three color principles, and inventing color photography, he did all